I'm Erin McDade. I work for Architecture 2030, although I'm doing this as a citizen and a volunteer, but using my work there to inform this. And I'll start us off, and then Mark Schofield from Opportunity Council and Mark Gardner from the city will also be adding to this. Similarly to the transportation group, the buildings group has been meeting multiple times a month with a group of about 10 community experts in this, and we've been putting in a lot of, back-end effort. And so what is up today is a high-level consolidation of that back-end effort, and it is a work in progress, but it's where we've gotten after a lot of talking, a lot of research, a lot of mining of our expert knowledge. And also just to kind of, again, set the context and the perspective, much like the transportation group did, the city council has a resolution. The resolution says that we need to get to zero GHG emissions by 2030, 2035 in the community, and they asked our task force to tell them how we're going to do that. So that's a big goal. That's a big ask, and it's very aggressive. And our group, the buildings group, is taking these two pieces of the pie, of the whole city emissions pie, which represent about 43% of our city's total emissions. So everything you'll see in this presentation from here on out is saying, how do we take these two pieces of the pie and get them to zero within about 15 years? Pretty aggressive. So a quick snapshot of what our city's building stock looks like, and also really the data that was used most to inform how we went about developing these decarbonization recommendations. So as Derek set up really well, our city is largely single family by far. 50% of our building stock is single family almost. And then we have some more multifamily, and then 28% commercial building stock. And all of the emissions graphs that you're going to see in here are emissions in 2035, which is our target date, assuming we take no more action, except for the fact that we are assuming now, since the state passed the law, that PSE will get to zero by 2045. So that's the only assumption built into these emissions graphs. So if we take no action, except PSE makes that mandate, in 2035, we would be seeing about 58% of our building sector emissions from natural gas and 42% from electricity. And so all of our recommendations are heavily based on the fact that, one, we need to support PSE in getting to zero by adding as much renewables as possible. And the building stock is this great opportunity to house in-city renewables to support not only the increased demand, but support PSE meeting those goals. And then the other piece that is consistent throughout ours, what's consistent in the transportation one, is that we have to electrify. If we don't electrify, no matter how well PSE does, this yellow chunk of the pie is never going away. And then the other piece that really informed our approach to developing these policy recommendations is the fact that of our entire building stock, the buildings under 10K square feet, which is about 24,000 buildings, again, we have so much single family, this makes sense, would in 2035 represent a little over half of our GHG emissions, which means that there's this really small cohort of big buildings that represent, in this case, about 42% of our city's GHG emissions in 2035. And this has good policy implications, because the financing, the way building upgrades are attacked from that big building perspective is really different from the way that they would be tackled from that small buildings perspective. And so we've split these two up as well, which you'll see moving forward. So here are decarbonization proposals. So we're going to start first with the big buildings. And so taking just the big buildings, just that over 10K piece of the pie, the breakdown is almost all commercial, not surprising. And then, of course, we do have some bigger multifamily that's over 10K square feet. And again, emissions in 2035, assuming we don't do anything, it'll be about 50-50 dominated by electricity, natural gas, since our electricity grid won't be fully clean by then. I do want to caveat with saying that this is making an assumption that PSE goes linearly from today to zero in 2045. I thought I had the data and I don't have it, so this might be updated and changed, but it's a reasonable estimate. And so, as I said, there's some key characteristics of big buildings that were helpful to us in looking at our recommendations. So larger buildings are typically, especially in Bellingham, many of them are owned by single owners, and they have long-term planned capital improvement cycles and capital improvement budgets. So if they know what is coming down the line, if they know what is required, they can plan their budgets around making sure those upgrades are implemented. And additionally, since this is a really small cohort of buildings, toolkits, policy incentives, et cetera, which Mark Gardner will go into a little bit more, can be very specifically targeted to make sure we're supporting this small group of buildings that need to implement these upgrades. And so our proposal for the big buildings sector is that there are two different pathways that they can take to achieve the target by 2035. The first pathway is a prescriptive pathway where we'll just kind of tell them what they have to do and they plan when and how they want to do that around their capital budgets. And so the first requirement of that pathway would be that they have to electrify their space and water heating systems. And I'll note that this was an important part of our conversation, though the electrification would have a minimum efficiency threshold, which would mean that certain electric systems would not be allowed, and those systems have, I could go into these as I want. They have all kinds of not as positive benefits as systems like heat pumps and other systems, and so we would want to make sure we were setting that. And then also, they would be required to install solar PV on at least 50% of their roof space, or if they couldn't do that for some reason, purchase the equivalent amount of renewables in community solar. So that's the prescriptive pathway. The performance-based pathway, which has the benefit of flexibility, it gives the building owner the freedom to make whatever changes they want whenever they want, as long as they're meeting these cycles, is a GHG emissions reduction pathway. And so they'd be required to reduce by 35% by 2025, progressively up to 100% by 2035. And I mean, I will say that essentially this would require the same thing. They would never be able to do this without electrifying, without probably putting in some energy efficiency. This would allow building owners to, if they wanted to improve their building's efficiency or reduce the amount of energy that they consume, they could wrap that in. And then to get to zero GHG emissions, they will certainly need to invest in renewables, since PSE's grid won't be zero by then. So it would really be supporting our goals, even if they weren't doing this first pathway. And then the small buildings group, so that group of 24,000 or whatever buildings that are largely single family, there are two different characteristics of these buildings that are really important from a policy perspective. Renter-occupied buildings are very different than owner-occupied buildings for a lot of reasons. And so for those small buildings, the renter-occupied buildings are primarily multifamily. 72% of our multifamily buildings are renter-occupied, or in a smaller but not insignificant group are single-family buildings. And much like the large buildings, which have planned cycles of spending, the rental buildings have planned cycles of rental inspection and license renewal. And so, I will note that this applies only to residential buildings, and so we're still working on this chunk of 12% commercial buildings, what that might entail for them. But what we decided is that we could align our upgrade requirements around those rental license renewal, inspection and renewal cycles. But unlike the large buildings, this is a group where the owners are obviously not the occupiers, and a lot of times the renters are lower income and housing is really expensive here. So financing for this so that it doesn't get passed on to the tenants is incredibly important. And so for this subsection of the building sector, subsidizing these upgrades as much as possible, and again, Mark will spend a little bit more time, oh, there you are. Mark will spend a bit more time talking about those options, is incredibly important. But again, since it's very similar to the large buildings and that there can be long-term planning around those cycles of inspection, it's the same two pathways we're proposing as we propose for the big building pathways. And then the other group, the arguably most difficult to tackle group, is this 20,000-ish buildings that are owner-occupied, primarily single-family buildings. And the key question here, of course, is how do we possibly implement upgrades on 20,000 buildings in about 15 years? And that that's a big ask. And so we are proposing a pathway that will touch a lot of the buildings, potentially not every single one of them, and we'll have, based on the way that we're proposing financing structure, we'll have the minimal amount of economic and social impact possible for asking for such a big undertaking. And so what this is what we're calling a point of sale intervention, where every time a building is sold, within 12 months of purchase, the purchaser must meet a specific energy efficiency threshold. We're still working on the details of this. It's likely to be based on the age of the building. And this will be really helpful so that they're not buying larger systems and not buying more renewables than they need, and so their utility bills are lower. They must install solar PV, again, that's equivalent to at least 50% of the roof area, or buy immediately into PSE's Green Direct. Had I not put this in today, I would have confirmed this with you. Thank you. Uh-oh. Mark, how do I get it back to it? Oh, thanks. Okay, sorry. So buy into the Green Power Program, and then within 24 months of purchase, they must electrify their space and water heating systems. But the key 2 points of this, again, the 2 key points of this are, 1, that these upgrades are paid for by the purchaser, not by the seller, and 2, we have a whole host of financing mechanisms, both that already exist and that we're proposing, that wrap the cost of these upgrades into your mortgage financing or your on-bill financing. So this is, if this is implemented the way we're proposing, this is 0 additional upfront costs. It's likely less than $100 addition a month to your mortgage payment, and that is supported by a reduction in utility bill costs. So I know that's a lot. I can see some faces looking, but. And so then the final cohort of buildings that we haven't talked about is new construction, right? We're not just stopping at the buildings we have. Our population's growing a lot. We project a lot of additional growth. Hopefully, some of Derek's land use proposals will be implemented. A lot of that growth will be denser, and that will have big benefits in terms of reducing building sector GHG emissions as well. But again, assuming no action other than this trending down of PSE's emissions, we still, this blue chunk at the end here would be emissions from new buildings that we would see in 2035 if we didn't do anything about that. And so our proposal for all new construction is that we simply, the city of Bellingham adopts state building code efficiency standards, and our state is great with building codes. We have very aggressive codes that are getting more and more aggressive. Again, install solar PVs or purchase the equivalent off-site community solar, and then fully electric space and water heating systems. And then the additional piece of this for new construction that we haven't asked for the others is that any natural gas used for another purpose has to be offset by producing or procuring renewable energy. By far, the majority of natural gas use is space and water heating, but I mean, we all like to cook on our natural gas stoves. A lot of people have natural gas fireplaces. There are some building types like restaurants and other very energy intensive types that depend heavily on natural gas, and it's a big ask potentially to just say no more natural gas. But that's the path that we're trending towards, and so if that's going to be used in order to meet our targets, it has to be offset. Okay, that was a lot.
Thanks, Erin. So in order to move down this pathway of very aggressive greenhouse gas reduction emission proposals in the building sector, we need resources and money. And it's not enough to just have requirements. You have to make it easy for people, and you have to make it affordable. So we've talked about a set of things that would move us along those lines. So the first thing is that we need to have a kind of a technical assistance and design services program, and also really a paradigm of the way we would do business. We'd be a lot more proactive in how we move people to be directed to the best and less expensive ways to make the changes that are needed. So the goal is to support residents and commercial customers with immediate and appropriate assistance to help them with energy upgrades regardless of the complexity of their project. One piece of this would be for the city to up its game in terms of its expertise in green building, either through cross-training of its entire staff or hiring a green building specialist who helps direct people in to the right place. Simple projects could be referred directly to qualified contractors. More complicated residential or commercial projects could be referred to the Community Energy Challenge for more of a wraparound and general technical assistance package, including audits and assessments and things like that of the needs. We also talked about how, at least for some projects, the cost of design work could possibly be subsidized or at least standardized. So we've got some off-the-shelf technologies that people can tap into easily. They don't have to reinvent the wheel or fish around for contractors that know what they're doing. We would help move them in that direction. Lastly, technical assistance would include information on financing mechanisms, incentives, and rebates to ensure that costs are not a barrier. So that's the first thing, is a wraparound set of technical assistance and design services. Second, we think we need something like a Bellingham Clean Energy Fund. So the goal would be to create a Bellingham Clean Energy Fund to catalyze substantial and rapid investments, capitalized with funds from a variety of possible sources. Possible funding sources include the State Department of Commerce Clean Energy Fund. The state has millions of dollars available every year. They do some of it for finance. Unclear if they will have proposals that would fit this, but it's certainly worth looking or even proposing it to them, that they help cities out with this sort of transition. Second, private philanthropy. People will say, oh yeah, right, that's going to happen. But Bloomberg just gave $1 million to Fort Collins for its rental efficiency program. They also provided grants for 8 other cities. So there's money out there for leading cities that are doing innovative things. The third possibility is a community foundation. Right now, the Whatcom Community Foundation is working to raise $5 million to create a revolving fund for reducing the financing costs of low-income housing projects and otherwise assisting in low-income housing development. We think there might be some interest in the community to have a similar type of fund for energy transition. And lastly, there could be an increase in the city gas utility tax. This would require putting a measure on the ballot to phase in an increase in the current rate over time. And lower-income households would be exempted from paying the tax. So those are just a set of possible funding mechanisms for this fund. But we think that particularly for some building owners, the cost is high in relation to energy savings. So we think we need some ability to buy down the cost under some scenarios. So this would be one way to do it. In terms of what it would do, these are some examples. It could provide cash incentives for major projects, particularly for low and moderate income households. It could capitalize a revolving fund for loans for upgrades. It could also provide assistance for solar investments. Those are just some examples. There's other mechanisms out there. There's more than are listed here, but these are some of the most useful types of things that we identified. There is something called a federal 203K mortgage, which allows you to roll in upgrades of all sorts, including just renovations, but also major energy upgrades into the home mortgage. So that's supported by the federal government. There's also Fannie Mae, which is federally, it's a kind of public-private partnership refinancing agency. They have a series of products that help finance energy upgrades. To be honest, I just learned about this today, and there were 5 or 6 different products, so I'm not an expert on that yet, but there's many things out there where you can greatly reduce the cost of these types of upgrades. This one here, on-bill financing, is more of a mechanism. It's a way of paying back loans that you might receive through various programs, and it basically has a monthly or bi-monthly charge for the cost of the retrofitting that you did. And right now, Washington does not require energy utilities to do this, but some utilities are doing this voluntarily. For example, Opalco on the San Juan Islands offers an on-bill financing program where you can pay back energy upgrades over time. And Bellingham does have a utility. We don't have an electric utility, but we do have, at least theoretically, the ability to bill people. So if we could work out a mechanism as a kind of a final possibility here if the other options didn't work. And lastly, some cities are trying tax credits against specific project purchases. For example, Berkeley, this is not the exact analogy, but they've got a retrofit program where they allow a portion of the project cost to be deducted directly from a tax that would otherwise be owed to the city. In that case, it's a real estate transfer tax. If something were done locally here, it would be basically a credit against the real estate excise tax for qualified projects. And so those are some of the mechanisms we're looking at. A lot of things are out there. They don't require a penny from the city. They're out there. They're established. There hundreds of millions of dollars of financing is getting pushed out the door every month. Other things would be new, and we really think we need a mix. And not to, I don't want to forget just the fact that there's many rebates available for these upgrades already from the utilities, which also help reduce the cost. So those are some set of things to support investments that we think would make it easier to make this transition. And that's it for mine.
So I'm Mark Schofield, member of the Buildings Work Group, and I wanted to share a couple elements from the work group template, which is forming the basis of the report that we'll be presenting to City Council, or sort of the format we're using. So one of the lenses we're looking through in our triple bottom line plus technology approach is social impact, so looking at equity and other social considerations. And so I just wanted to share a few principles that we're using when we're evaluating some of these policy measures. This is a big deal, obviously, what we're presenting, what transportation is presenting. There are major upfront implementation costs. So I think that's part of what we need to look at, as well as the long-term economic, social, and health benefits of achieving these stretch and ambitious goals the city has put forward. Another principle is providing a clear timeline, so looking out to 2035, and if there are benchmarks along the way, so building owners can plan their implementation, and providing subsidies or other financing options, which Mark just covered for us. Also ensuring that low and moderate income households are not unfairly burdened with the costs related to complying with some of these policies, and looking at appropriate exemptions, as well as ensuring people have access to other programs which exist in our community to reduce energy burden, things like energy assistance, low-income weatherization, which in the last 20 years has weatherized, I think, over 600 low-income homes within city limits, as well as Community Energy Challenge, which provides support to, it provides low-cost audits and incentives to do energy retrofits in homes. And CEC has completed over 700 residential projects in the last 10 years. So there are resources out there. We want to make sure that folks, especially low-income, moderate-income households, have access to those resources. Another element of our work group template has to do with communication. So what are our communication needs around these accelerated goals? There are really a couple key areas that need to be communicated. One is just communicating the policies. So what are the requirements and what are the allowable pathways for meeting those requirements, whether they're existing small, existing large, or new buildings. Communicating the timeline for implementation and all of the available resources, the technical support and financing options. And the city has lots of great ways it communicates already through a variety of methods, from mailings to outreach to critically interacting with building owners, whether in permitting processes or during inspections, like with the rental inspection program. So communicating about the policies, but then there's kind of communicating why we're doing this as a community. Why are we taking on this ambitious goal, and what are the benefits that can come along with it? So, some examples of benefits of electrification include the fact that it's more and more a sustainable pathway as Washington's electrical grid gets progressively cleaner through the clean energy bill that was passed this year, which is going to result in carbon neutral energy grid by 2045, I believe it is. And also another benefit of electrification is eliminating potentially significant sources of indoor air pollution from combusting gas, things like carbon monoxide or formaldehyde or other pollutants. So I think it's communicating what the benefits can come from electrification, because it's a big change. A lot of the city, as we saw from Aaron's graphs, a lot of the city's buildings are heated or powered in other ways by natural gas. Also talking about the co-benefits of on-site renewables and energy efficiency, which are components of these policies we're recommending. So especially this is a big deal for rentals where building owners are not responsible for paying the utilities and maybe don't have as much of an incentive to make those energy upgrades. So that can include reducing energy, doing energy efficiency and on-site renewables can reduce the energy burden of households, so their energy costs would be lower. Improved indoor air quality and home health is another benefit of efficiency measures like weatherization. And then, of course, local job creation. It's going to take HVAC, solar installers, a number of professionals in our community. We already have a really robust industry here, but this could greatly expand opportunities, job opportunities in this area.